Hey guys, tonight we're wandering through the velvet hush of an Ottoman garden somewhere between midnight and a dream, where the air is warm, thick with jasmine, and slow-moving like syrup in a forgotten teacup. The moon hangs overhead, like it's unsure whether to be a sultan or a servant, and each blade of grass seems to stand just a little taller, as if awaiting inspection from someone important who never quite arrives. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain gurgles not urgently, just enough to remind you that water still exists. Somewhere closer, a goat belches. The ground beneath your slippers, because of course you're in slippers, is tiled in faded blue and green patterns, chipped by time and maybe the occasional dropped copper tray. Every few feet, a different scent brushes past your nose like a distracted noble. Rose, musk, citrus, and something else that's either cardamom or someone's forgotten lunch. There's a sense that if you turned one more corner, you might find an old man asleep with a pruning shear in hand, snoring under a fig tree he never meant to climb. This is the world of Ottoman garden design. Not just a place for plants, but for perfume, poetry, and power games that involved more flower beds than battlefields. Here, flowers were declarations, scents were arguments, and pathways curled like half-finished thoughts. You probably wouldn't survive it, though not because of the political intrigue or goat-related mishaps, but because the sun would rise long before you found the exit, and the gardeners had a rather blunt view of tourists who trampled their hyacinths. They once chased a Venetian ambassador clear into a pond for stepping on a prized rose. The ambassador was reportedly delighted, claiming it was the most refreshing dip he'd ever had, while being shouted at in Turkish. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I promise more wandering stories, more sleepy facts, and the occasional surprise goat. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And what scent would your dream garden carry? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins, as so many do, with tulips, not the kind that sit awkwardly in grocery store buckets, but the kind that were once considered status symbols, sacred geometry, and mild addiction all rolled into one. Ottoman tulips, those bulbous, delicately twisted blooms weren't planted just for their beauty. Oh no, they were arranged according to fragrance, lineage, and in some deeply confusing cases, what dreams the gardeners had the night before. You see, the Ottoman Empire had a phase, some say a fever, called tulipomania, not to be confused with the Dutch version, which mostly involved markets and money. This one was more poetic and far less regulated. Tulips were bred, exchanged, and arranged not for profit but for prestige. The right tulip in the right corner of the right courtyard could mean a subtle nod from the Sultan. The wrong one, wilted and drooping. That could mean an awkward transfer to goat-watching duty. Historians still argue whether this obsession began with a single eccentric sultan or a particularly persuasive poet. Some believe it was the work of an old gardener named Esref, who insisted that tulips whispered advice if you leaned in just right and hadn't had breakfast yet. Esref was known to wander barefoot through the palace grounds, murmuring compliments to petals and once biting a rival who claimed carnations were more spiritually refined. He retired early, but tulips, yes, they weren't just decorative, they were deployed strategically. Each bed was placed to catch the breeze, ensuring that scent would waft toward courtyards, down-tiled hallways, even through the open window of a particularly grumpy vizier who, despite his allergies, found himself unreasonably soothed by the scent of a double-layered red and white hybrid known as lion's breath. The design of the gardens themselves reflected this olfactory politics. Paths curved gently, avoiding harsh angles to allow wind to glide smoothly, carrying fragrances with almost musical grace. Shrubs were kept low, not just for aesthetics, but so the lavender and rosewater blends wouldn't hit dead ends, a perfume that stopped moving. The court believed was a perfume wasted. Now, imagine this. A tax collector arrives, sweaty and disheveled, papers tucked under one arm, eyes squinting at the layout of a new pleasure garden he's been told to assess. But instead of evaluating cost or irrigation systems, he's suddenly overwhelmed by a scent so enchanting it makes him forget what the decimal system is. He sits down beneath an almond tree, sighs, and decides the garden must be paid for twice, just in case. This may or may not have happened, but it does explain a curious over-budget incident in 1582 that no one ever quite accounted for. Fragrance, you see, was not indulgence in the empire. It was politics. It was diplomacy. It was the empire saying, without saying, look what we can do with wind and soil and patience. And if we can do this to your nose, imagine what we can do to your army. Sometimes the scent was even stronger than the message. The man who nearly upended an entire garden project over the smell of damask roses was not, strictly speaking, a gardener. His name was Reshid Efendi, and he wore his bureaucratic robes like a man born into a deep and personal feud with starch. He had risen through the ranks of the Ottoman civil service largely by being the only person in the room who could both recite tax policy backwards and describe the proper etiquette for sniffing a tulip without offending the janissaries. Reshid had opinions, too many, frankly, but none as persistent as his belief that gardens, not armies, not treaties, not even spices were the true measure of an empire. And not just any gardens, mind you, scented gardens, meticulously curated symphonies of smell, where jasmine softened, court gossip and basil quietly corrected the mood of an angry eunuch. He once proposed that the Grand Vizier's council chamber be retrofitted with a revolving dais of seasonal herbs to improve strategic decision-making. The idea was politely tabled. The dais, however, was built anyway and later repurposed to serve kebabs. One especially warm spring, Reshid was invited, or rather, permitted to attend a planning session for the redesign of the private garden at Topkapi Palace. He arrived armed with scrolls, scent charts, and an alarming amount of dried sage. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, discussions of irrigation, footpath stonework, and whether peacocks counted as necessary expenses. But Reshid, who had not been invited to speak, cleared his throat anyway, several times. At last, when the chief architect mentioned planting roses along the northern wall purely for visual balance, Reshid rose with the solemnity of a man about to deliver an unwanted sermon. Roses, he said, must never be planted where the morning sun fails to strike them before the first tea is poured. Their fragrance suffers, their dignity wanes, and frankly, it's just rude. There was a long silence, during which the sound of distant pruning could be heard, and a bird let out a rather skeptical chirp. The chief architect, a man named Khalil, with eyebrows like architectural features themselves, raised one of them and blinked slowly. You want us to reposition the entire garden, Khalil said, because the roses might feel underappreciated. No, Reshid replied gravely. I want you to consider their morale. What followed can only be described as a polite mutiny of glances. But Reshid pressed on, producing a small chart from his sleeve. Though where exactly in his sleeve it had been hiding remains a matter of mild palace legend. The chart showed, in neat calligraphy and floral illustrations, a theoretical overlay of scent dispersal patterns based on wind direction, elevation, and species-specific aroma longevity. It was to be fair, stunningly researched. Historians still argue whether Reshid had actually consulted gardeners or simply sniffed his way through the archive himself. But what's certain is that his arguments resulted in a minor redesign of the rose quadrant. The change was begrudgingly acknowledged as an improvement when, several months later, a visiting diplomat remarked that the garden smelled like a memory I haven't had yet. Reshid's triumph, however, was short-lived. 2 days after the redesign, one of the palace cats, fat, judgmental, and allegedly literate in Greek, began using the new rose bed as a private conference room. The scent of roses was joined by the distinctly less ceremonial aroma of territorial feline commentary. The gardeners, naturally, were furious. They respected roses. They even tolerated Reshid. But cats with opinions? That was a step too far. A compromise was struck. A small section of marjoram was planted to the side, supposedly unappealing to cats, but delightful to the kitchen staff. The cat, ever contrary, immediately began napping in the marjoram. It was the first of many such truces negotiated under the shade of a particularly unimpressed fig tree. This was Ottoman garden design. In a nutshell, if you can imagine a particularly fragrant, architecturally detailed nutshell, every decision was layered, every scent a signal. A bed of lavender wasn't just calming. It was a gentle reminder to passing scribes that ink spills were not forgiven before the afternoon call to prayer. A cluster of hyacinths might be planted where political visitors tended to pause in hopes of soothing tempers before they reached the meeting hall, or at least distracting them from the ever-rising construction costs. Reshid, for all his bluster, had tapped into something the gardeners already knew in their bones and boots. That scent was not just sensory, it was social. The right perfume at the right place, an hour could smooth over missed appointments, heal tiny insults, and even obscure the less noble smells of an empire that, like all empires, was prone to the occasional lapse in sanitation. Even the bathhouses took cues from the gardens. Attendants sprinkled dried rose petals in steam chambers, claiming it improved circulation. Whether it did or not, it certainly improved the mood of several grumpy pashas who otherwise might have sued over lukewarm tile work. And while Reshid eventually moved on to other projects like proposing that certain legal documents be perfumed with mint to keep readers alert, his influence lingered. The roses remained. The morning sun caught their petals just so, and every now and then a new visitor would pause, sniff the air, and wonder aloud if the garden had always been this enchanting, to which a gardener, crouched nearby and pretending not to listen, would mutter something about sage and leave it at that. One of the more charming myths whispered among the garden workers, usually late at night, when the air was thick with honeysuckle and gossip, was that the wind itself had once been on the payroll. Not officially, of course. The empire never figured out how to tax a breeze, but ask any gardener worth his trowel, and he'd tell you that the wind was a crucial, if unruly, member of the landscaping team. Ottoman gardens weren't built merely to be seen. They were built to be experienced deeply and repeatedly, preferably while holding a lukewarm cup of bitter tea and pretending not to hear the fountain whispering your secrets. The scent, the feel, the drift of it all, it had to move. And the wind, unpredictable though it was, served as the great unseen usher of fragrance. The best gardeners knew how to read the wind the way an old innkeeper reads the face of a nobleman, pretending to be a traveler. They'd wet a fingertip, close one eye, and mutter things like west-northwest good for roses, terrible for mint. Then they'd shuffle a few ceramic pots around, as though this gesture alone would steer nature's will. Sometimes it even worked. The gardens themselves were laid out with wind paths in mind, not straight like a parade ground, nor chaotic like the marketplace. Curved paths, shallow arcs, clever funneling between low walls, and clipped hedges, they coaxed the breeze rather than ordered it. It was said that if you stood just right at sunset, the wind would carry the smell of blooming citrus from one courtyard, swirl it with sandalwood from another, and deliver it perfectly blended right to the edge of the imperial bathhouse, where the Sultan's favorite towel folder was waiting, with an unnecessarily embroidered linen. Historians still argue whether this was design or accident. A few suggest that the Sultan himself once issued a decree requiring wind harmony in new gardens, though no official copy of such a decree survives, likely because it was carried off by a gust before the ink dried. Others believe the credit belongs to a now forgotten architect named Murad the Half-Awake, who designed garden layouts while reclining on a silk cushion and listening to how his sleep breath disrupted the scent of incense. One tale entirely unverifiable, but far too specific to be invented, claims that an experimental orchard was once designed in concentric rings, each ring planted with a flower or herb of increasing intensity. In the very center stood a single, strangely aloof gardener whose job was to sniff. Take a single step and sniff again, like a perfume sommelier lost in a maze. They say he could identify 27 separate scents in a single inhalation, and once fainted from the combination of marjoram and accidental goat proximity. Ah, yes, the goat. It was always there, somewhere in the story. Sometimes sleeping under a quince tree, sometimes chewing on a tassel that definitely belonged to someone important. It never had a name, or rather, it had too many. Scarf thief. General Hoofington, that one. It understood neither fences nor protocol, but had an uncanny habit of arriving just in time to test the wind direction, usually by standing directly in it and sneezing mightily toward the pomegranate beds. Some of the more practical-minded officials wanted to rid the gardens of all animals, especially unpredictable ones. But the gardeners, many of whom had worked these beds longer than most officials had kept their titles, insisted that the wind behaved better when someone was there to greet it, 4 hooves and all. Besides, as one elderly groundskeeper noted, while sharpening a trowel that doubled as a back scratcher, the goat knows where the lavender blooms best. It wasn't just goats and wind, of course. There was a particular philosophy at work, borrowed in bits from Persian garden traditions, Byzantine mosaic geometry, and a touch of something unspoken and possibly mystical. The Ottomans believed in what they sometimes called the breath of paradise. The idea that heaven wasn't just a place of visual perfection, but a world of smells, so divine they could lull a soul into blissful stillness. To that end, garden layouts weren't just about maximizing space or shade. They were about orchestrating movement not of people, but of scent. A peasant might wander through unaware, thinking only of how pleasant the breeze was that day. But the courtier, the poet, the gardener, they would know. They would feel the shift as they turned a corner, and the wind dropped jasmine into their path. Like a secret, they would nod, slightly, as if acknowledging a job well done. It's even said that certain pavilions were placed not for the view, but to intercept specific cross breezes. One such structure, long since crumbled, was known unofficially as the Pavilion of Evening Basil, not because basil was grown near it, but because
The wind passed over the herb beds several terraces up and delivered their scent precisely at twilight to the pavilion's open eastern window, at least when the goat didn't block it. Wind, as it turns out, had moods. It liked some corners more than others. It carried hints of the sea one day and of fig trees the next. And always, the gardeners adjusted. They trimmed, they whispered. They sometimes bribed the wind with offerings of saffron tea left out on stone ledges, because one could never be too sure. And if all else failed, they waited for nightfall, when the wind, like an old friend with strange habits, returned to wander the paths on its own, slipping past the citrus trees, tugging at the linen drapes of the pavilions, carrying forgotten verses from the lips of retired poets, and blending them with the scent of blooming violets into something that smelled faintly like memory, somewhere near the outskirts of Edirne, where the air grows heavy with river mist and lazy ambition. There once lived two minor officials locked in a quiet, perfumed war over jasmine. Their names are mostly forgotten, probably something like Hassan and Samel, or Mehmet and also Mehmet, as is traditional when storytellers grow fuzzy. But their feud is remembered among garden hands and bored archivists who enjoy scent-related bureaucracy. One of them, the more fastidious of the pair, had cultivated a hedge of jasmine so thick and heady that passers-by sometimes fainted with delight or confusion. The other responded by commissioning an entire colonnade wrapped in night-blooming honeysuckle, lit by lanterns that flickered dramatically, but failed to keep moths away. To the outside observer, their rivalry was subtle. A few extra rose bushes here, a suspiciously timed order of cinnamon bark there. But to anyone who understood Ottoman garden etiquette, it was a battle fought in fragrance, one strategic blossom at a time. The jasmine hedge, which curved dramatically along the eastern edge of the official's property, became a local phenomenon. Poets came to lean against it, sigh loudly, and compose verses they forgot to finish. A violinist once stood beside it for 3 hours, playing the same melancholic note until his strings snapped from humidity. The hedge became known as the Breath of 9 Evenings, mostly because someone with a mustache said it sounded poetic, and no one argued, not to be outdone. The rival official attempted to commission a hedge of his own, this time of damask roses imported from far-flung corners of the empire. Unfortunately, due to a clerical error and possibly the goat, he received a shipment of garlic chives and 3 barrels of fish sauce. It took weeks to recover from the olfactory catastrophe. Garden guests politely claimed it smelled of the sea, while secretly wiping tears from their eyes and planning polite escapes. Historians still argue whether these scented skirmishes influenced imperial policy. One theory suggests that certain tax exemptions were granted to gardeners who could produce flowers capable of calming border disputes. Another claims that the Sultan once sent jasmine wreaths to the Venetian ambassador in lieu of formal condemnation, a gesture that backfired when the ambassador mistook the flowers for an invitation to courtship. What is known as this: fragrance was not a casual affair. It was power in petal form. To overwhelm a rival with scent was to assert superiority without ever raising your voice or your sword. And jasmine, being both intoxicating and notoriously difficult to prune without emotional consequences, was the weapon of choice for passive-aggressive nobles everywhere. The gardeners, naturally, bore the brunt of this nasal arms race. One in particular, a man named Yusuf, with a limp and a profound hatred of jasmine mites, became something of a reluctant legend. Every morning, he rose before dawn to inspect the hedge, muttering to himself in 3 languages and wielding a pair of shears that looked suspiciously like repurposed surgical tools. He claimed the jasmine whispered to him. He also claimed that the hedge had grown sentient and was plotting to strangle a magistrate. Though most chalked that up to heat stroke, still, Yusuf's efforts were admired. Under his care, the hedge flourished until one unfortunate night, a gust of wind carried a rare pollen blend directly into the open window of the rival official's reading room. The man awoke sneezing, declared war on horticultural arrogance, and ordered a team of scribes to invent a new, non-jasmine-based philosophy of garden design. It never caught on. Meanwhile, the jasmine remained. It bloomed, it wafted, it enchanted, and eventually it outlived both officials, who were last seen arguing over whether sandalwood or saffron paired better with political betrayal. The garden, no longer divided by ego, grew together, though the jasmine still leaned slightly eastward, as if remembering the days when it was considered both battleground and peace offering. In the years that followed, the tale of the dueling hedges became part of local lore. Children were warned never to mock a jasmine bush, lest it take offense. Elders claimed to smell faint hints of saffron or regret, depending on the season. And travelers passing through Edirne would sometimes pause, inhale deeply, and wonder why their thoughts suddenly turned to love letters they'd never written. To this day, if you stand near where the hedge once stood, and the wind is feeling particularly nostalgic, you might catch a scent so rich, so layered, that it stops you mid-step. And for just a moment, the world smells not of dust or duty, but of something tender and slightly absurd, like an empire that once took flowers very, very seriously. They say the goose arrived on a Tuesday. No one knows how it got past the outer guards, nor why it honked in iambic rhythm. But arrive it did, waddling proudly through the gardens of Topkapi Palace, like a dignitary from some obscure waterfowl republic. Its feathers were too clean for a common goose, and its eyes, according to one gardener, contained knowledge of the spice roots. Naturally, this led to complications. The goose first appeared during an early spring inspection, just as the chief palace gardener, Nureddin, was trying to explain why the galangal root had failed to thrive near the fountains. His theory involved shadow angles, the smell of sandalwood, and a distant nephew with questionable watering habits. But no one was listening. The goose had climbed onto the marble edge of a lily pool and was now examining the surface like a disappointed sommelier. It honked once, then waddled toward the herb beds. It paused before each plant, sniffed with great deliberation, then moved on, ignoring the sage, frowning at the time, and nearly toppling into a vat of pickled dates. Eventually, it stopped in front of a single galangal sprout and sat down with an air of finality, as if declaring, "This one," historians still argue whether the goose was trained, enchanted, or simply bored. A few claim it was the reincarnation of a former palace chef, though this theory rests entirely on the goose's fondness for cinnamon and its tendency to peck at lazy apprentices. Whatever the truth, the goose became an unofficial consultant. Whenever a planting decision stumped the gardeners, they'd lead the bird along the rows and watch where it lingered. Its preferences shaped spice arrangements for nearly a year. One palace concubine reported that the goose once chose a patch of fennel so fragrant it gave her dreams of swimming in a sea of anise-scented tea. She woke up craving pastries and wrote a poem that no one dared criticize. This period of avian consultancy coincided with a notable rise in culinary harmony between the kitchens and the gardens. The chef claimed the dishes began to smell like memory and victory, while the head steward simply wept over a dish of quince stew and declared it emotionally balanced. But not everyone appreciated the goose. The court astrologer, already on edge due to a Saturn-Venus disagreement, accused the bird of disrupting the natural order. The librarian found a trail of droppings leading to a chewed scroll
on ancient irrigation methods and muttered darkly about feathered sabotage. The goat, previously unchallenged in its role as resident mischief maker, sulked for weeks and was last seen attempting to out-honk its rival during a moonlit standoff near the fig trees. Then came the incident with the galangal root. One afternoon, the goose refused to approach the galangal bed. It stood at the edge, flapped its wings ominously, and waddled away. The next morning, a gardener discovered that the soil was too acidic due to runoff from an overzealous lemon grove experiment. The goose had known. It had warned them. From that day forward, it was given a shallow dish of rose water to drink and a little embroidered collar with a tulip motif. A scribe attempted to name it Cushbe the aromatic, but the name never stuck. Most simply called it the goose, spoken with a mix of reverence and bafflement. It was during this time that the concubine known only as Lady Foray commissioned a poem in honor of the goose's service. The poem was 78 verses long, rhymed in triplets, and was said to be so delicately scented with rose ink that it caused sneezing among the less poetic readers. She read it aloud once in the courtyard, accompanied by a flute and a harp made of cedar wood. The goose fell asleep halfway through. This, Faria declared, was the highest compliment. Eventually, as all mysterious figures do, the goose vanished. One day it was there, nibbling contentedly on a basil stem. The next, gone, leaving behind only a single perfect feather on the galangal bed and a faint smell of cardamom that lingered for weeks. Some say it flew south. Others believe it walked into the library to finish reading that irrigation scroll. One gardener insisted it was last seen riding atop a cartload of dried mint, looking wistfully toward the Bosphorus. But its legacy remained. The herb beds, once rigid in their arrangement, became more fluid, more exploratory. Gardeners began trusting their noses, their instincts, and occasionally small animals with strong opinions. The galangal grew better after they moved it to a shadier corner. And while no one said so aloud, they all knew why. And in the quiet hours, when the wind carried just a hint of spice, and the moon painted the fountains in silver, some claimed they could hear the faintest echo of a honk, drifting like a forgotten verse through the jasmine-laced air. There is a peculiar sort of silence that falls over a garden just after midnight. Not the silence of stillness, but the silence of things continuing softly without you. Leaves rustle with the secret confidence of having survived the sun. Petals sigh as they fold in for the night. And somewhere between the hedge maze and the second-best marble fountain, a gardener mutters curses at a moonbeam for revealing a patch of weeds he swore he'd already handled. It was in this hour, half sleep, half shadow, that the moonlight maintenance crews came out. Now, to be clear, these weren't official crews. The Empire didn't issue pay slips for midnight rose bothering or quiet clippings by candlelight. But every palace worth its peacocks had a few gardeners who preferred the dark hours, those cooler, quieter slices of the day when fragrance drifted sharper, and the risk of being asked to rearrange the lemon trees for the 5th time was blessedly low. One such man was Akif, elderly, nearly translucent, and rumored to have been part shrub himself. Akif had tended the palace gardens for so long that no one remembered if he was still on the payroll. He appeared only after the last call to prayer and vanished before sunrise. He didn't speak much, preferring to communicate via throat clearing, eyebrow tics, and, in rare cases, a faint whistle that seemed to correspond with specific pruning needs. Akif swore that flowers bloomed differently under moonlight. He claimed you could hear their opinions more clearly, especially the narcissus, which he believed were too proud by half during the day but tolerably philosophical at night. No one argued. For one thing, he was usually holding a rather sharp shear. For another, he was almost certainly right. Historians still debate whether moonlit gardening was a widespread practice or simply a side effect of too much cardamom tea. Some records suggest palace instructions included notes on cool hour cultivation, while others attribute it to eccentricity and the desire to avoid sunburns, biting insects, and the unsolicited advice of passing viziers. Regardless of its origins, the practice had benefits. For one, the plants appreciated it, or at least they didn't protest. Gardeners reported fewer pest problems among beds tended under moonlight, and some even claimed the scents grew stronger. Jasmine, in particular, was said to reveal its true character between midnight and the second crow of the rooster. Then there was the sweat factor. Daytime gardening in Ottoman summer heat was less pastoral elegance and more slowly simmering in one's own regrets. Nothing quite ruined the delicate balance of scent, layering like a sweaty gardener, losing consciousness next to the lavender. Hence, moonlight became not only romantic but refreshingly practical. Breezes cooled the wrists, shadows made excellent allies, and fewer people were around to critique your kneeling posture. Still, night gardening wasn't without hazards. Tools were easily misplaced. One unfortunate apprentice once mistook a pile of sleeping cats for a compost heap, resulting in an incident known locally as the hissing reckoning. A scribe attempted to record the event in poetry, but was thwarted by a lingering allergy and mild claw trauma. And then, of course, there was the issue of lighting. Candles were right out too windy. Lanterns attracted moths the size of modest sandwiches. The most successful night gardeners used the moon itself as their only light, adjusting their tasks to match the lunar cycle. Full moons meant detailed pruning. Crescents were for quiet observation. New moons, time to accidentally forget your tools and go home early. Akif, naturally, operated by instinct. He could trim a hedge blindfolded, though no one ever asked him to demonstrate. Because frankly, he kept a small pouch of rosewood dust to sprinkle on paths for better footing, and once stitched a belt lined with tiny spice sachets to mask the smell of old boots. When asked why he did this, he simply muttered, the mince judgmental. One of his few confidants was a boy named Salem, a night shift steward's son, who often wandered the garden after bedtime. He liked the smell of wet soil and didn't much care for sleeping. Salim would trail Akif in silence, sometimes holding a lamp, sometimes just watching the elder gently rebuke a lily for trying too hard. One night, Salim asked Akif if the flowers missed the sun. No, Akif said, adjusting a climbing vine. They like the moon better. The moon never tells them how to grow. That same evening, Salim wrote a note to himself on a scrap of parchment. The moon listens better than the sun. It was later found inside a poetry collection in the palace library, scribbled in the margins next to a recipe for rosewater pudding. Over time, moonlight gardening gained quiet fame. Visiting diplomats who couldn't sleep would stumble upon Akif or others trimming the shadows. Some claimed it was a sign of mystical wisdom. Others assumed it was a punishment for lazy daytime work. A few simply asked to sit nearby and inhale whatever scent the wind delivered. More than one political negotiation began in those silent garden hours over cooled tea, the rustle of fig leaves, and the low click of shears meeting stem. By the time Akif passed under a full moon, naturally the garden he'd tended for decades bore his mark in every curve and hush. The narcissus still stood taller at night. The jasmine never bloomed before dark. And somewhere near the east gate, a tiny plaque was hung beneath a creeping vine. It read,
Simply don't wake the mint.
It remembers, in the long and winding history of Ottoman gardens, there is perhaps no greater mystery than why the lilac offended the bard.
His name was Halil of the Soft Elbow, a title earned not through poetry, but by an unfortunate incident with a harp and a misunderstanding about seating arrangements. Halil was, by most measures, a reasonably respected court poet. His verses were admired, his metaphors occasionally understood, and he once made a janissary weep openly with a particularly tender sonnet about grilled apricots. But he hated lilacs. No one quite knew why. Some whispered that a childhood injury had occurred near a lilac bush. Others suggested a jilted lover had worn lilac oil, forever tainting the scent in his nostrils. Still others believed it was simply a matter of aesthetic revenge, that the lilac, with its smug little blossoms and unhurried scent, reminded Halil too much of rival poets who used too many adjectives. Whatever the origin, the feud was real.
Halil's poems routinely slandered lilacs with a venom he reserved for few other things,
including bureaucracy,
undercooked lamb,
and the lute player who insisted on improvising in D minor. One stanza read,
"Lilac,
that pompous purple lyre,
too sweet, too smug, too sore of petal, thy fragrance is a tired choir that sings of sleep and overcooked nettle."
To be fair, this poem was written during allergy season and shortly after a particularly discouraging game of chess,
but the sentiment held. The gardeners, of course,
noticed. They noticed everything, and they took it personally.
Lilacs had a proud place in the garden hierarchy.
They bloomed early,
held their scent with confidence,
and didn't require the dramatic sun-chasing antics of, say, the tulips. They were reliable,
elegant, and not given to self-indulgence. The gardeners loved them.
Halil's vendetta struck a nerve. In quiet retaliation, they began planting lilacs in increasing quantities. Not centrally, no. That would be too obvious.
Instead, they tucked them into corners where Halil was known to pace while composing. A cluster near the marble bench he favored,
another beside the fountain where he liked to argue about rhyming meter,
a particularly large one just outside the hall, where poetic recitations were held,
positioned so its scent would waft inside exactly 3 minutes after Halil began reading.
The effect was immediate.
Halil's poetry grew more frantic. His metaphors turned barbed. He accused the lilacs of plotting. When a well-meaning assistant offered him a bouquet before a reading, he hurled it into the koi pond and recited a spontaneous haiku about betrayal.
Historians still argue whether Halil was genuinely allergic or just dramatically committed. A few surviving notes from his journal, written in increasingly florid handwriting, suggest that he believed the lilacs were trying to seduce the garden itself. He described them as floral sycophants, and once compared their scent to the sigh of a failed tax reform.
But despite his protests, the public adored it.
Lilac-themed poems became fashionable.
Young lovers began quoting Halil's rants as flirtation. One particularly determined courtesan sent her suitor 30 lilac blossoms with attached verses, each signed, "With all my smugness." It was the beginning of a brief but highly aromatic courtship. Eventually,
Halil's war reached the ears of the Sultan.
Now, the Sultan was a patient man, but not an uncurious one. He summoned Halil for a private performance, just him, the bard, and a surprise bouquet of lilacs placed directly beside the throne.
Halil, sensing a trap but unwilling to abandon his pride,
launched into a tirade disguised as a sonnet,
accusing the lilac of treasonous lethargy and fragrant overreach. The Sultan listened.
He sipped his tea, and at the end, he clapped once, slowly, and said,
"You have made me feel very strongly about a bush."
Well done. It was, in court terms,
a promotion. From then on, Halil was officially recognized as the empire's florally adversarial poet. He was invited to critique gardens, attend bloom unveilings, and insult selected species for ceremonial purposes. He leaned into the role with the gusto of a man who had found his calling late but firmly. Meanwhile, the lilacs continued to bloom. They lined the walkways. They shaded pavilions. They filled the air with a scent that, if you inhaled deeply enough, might carry the faintest whiff of laughter. Some say the lilacs began to lean slightly whenever Halil passed, as if listening. Others claim the poet mellowed with age and was once seen resting beneath a particularly fragrant lilac bush, humming contentedly. His last known poem, scribbled on the back of a garden ledger, read simply, "Perhaps I judged too soon. Lilac, thou art a sleepy friend, a pillow for the afternoon." Whether it was sarcasm or surrender, no one could tell. But the lilacs didn't care. They swayed in the breeze, offered their perfume to the sky, and waited patiently for someone else to take offense. If you followed the curved path along the inner colonnade of the palace garden, past the stone bench shaped like a goose, don't ask. And just before the sycamore that had once allegedly insulted a janissary's hat, you'd arrive at a fork in the walkway. One side led to the rose quadrant, where soft diplomacy and softer poetry ruled. The other led to what became known with a certain degree of resigned reverence as the political path. This was no ordinary walkway. The political path, unlike its more perfumed neighbors, was designed with intent. And by intent, we mean the peculiar art of laying down scented plants, turning corners, and arranging shrubbery so precisely that they could calm tempers, provoke envy, disguise mutton, or even insult a visiting ambassador, all without a single word. It all began, as many such things do, with a quarrel. A particularly tense trade negotiation was underway between the empire and a group of Venetian diplomats who arrived wearing far too many feathers and carrying a scent that was best described as perfumed accounting anxiety. The meeting, held in a shaded garden alcove, had started badly and was threatening to slide into the kind of disagreement that required a new wall map and at least 2 apology carpets. In a moment of desperation or genius, the head gardener at the time, a woman named Aishi with eyes like sharpened trowels, decided to reroute the diplomat's procession through a less used corridor of the garden. This new path featured a clever blend of rosemary, marjoram, and a rare variety of citrus-scented thyme that smelled faintly like victory and warm bread. The change was immediate. By the time the delegates reached the courtyard, they were visibly calmer. One of them remarked that the garden reminded him of his grandmother's villa, which may or may not have existed. The negotiation concluded with fewer squabbles than expected, and the ambassador's hat remained unthrown, an improvement by Venetian standards. From then on, the garden became more than a place of leisure. It became a quiet arena for influence. Certain paths were lined with rose-scented geraniums, their soft perfume wafting into the minds of tired officials like warm reassurance. Others used strong mints or sharp citrus to spark alertness during long policy walks. One particularly bold stretch of gravel was flanked entirely by lavender and basil, perfect for the moments before an uncomfortable question or a deliberate silence. Historians still argue whether this was a formalized science or an instinctual art. Some claim detailed scent maps were drawn and redrawn to track which aromas best influenced specific courtiers. Others believe it was all rumor, bolstered by coincidence and one too many overly philosophical gardeners.
One scholar insists that a single juniper tree was responsible for 3 major tax reforms. No one has found proof, but the tree in question remains suspiciously well fed. There was, however, one undeniable incident. During a meeting between a young Ottoman vizier and a famously irritable Persian envoy, the chosen route passed through a pergola covered in honeysuckle, lemon balm, and a bit of strategically placed fennel. The vizier, a man whose voice cracked when he was nervous, had memorized exactly 3 diplomatic phrases, but when he stood to deliver them, the scent in the air hit them both at once. An overwhelming blend of sweetness and spice that caused the envoy to pause mid-scowl and say, "You know, this reminds me of my mother's garden." The vizier, sensing an opening, blurted, "Was she also fond of treaties?" It was, by every measure, a terrible response, but the envoy laughed, a real, human, rib-shaking laugh. The negotiation went smoother after that. They shook hands. They traded gifts. The fennel was credited in 3 separate garden logs and one rather unhinged poem titled O Aniseed Accord. The use of political scenting became an open secret. Courtiers began to suspect that their moods were being shaped by more than the weather or the proximity to their rivals. A few grew paranoid, carrying clove sachets or blocking their noses with bits of wool. This proved less effective than hoped, especially during a heat wave when several overdressed nobles fainted near the jasmine beds. Naturally, not all scents had noble uses. There were rumors completely unsubstantiated. Of course, that a certain garden path was designed not to soothe, but to unsettle. It passed through a tight corridor lined with bitter orange trees, wormwood bushes, and just enough mugwort to tickle the nose unpleasantly. Guests who walked it tended to emerge irritable, mildly confused, and eager to agree with whatever was said next, if only to leave faster. This path, known unofficially as the negotiation shortcut, was quietly retired after a visiting prince tripped, accused the azaleas of espionage, and attempted to exile a squirrel. Still, the idea stuck. Gardens could whisper. They could manipulate. They could speak politics in petals and perfume. By the late 17th century, the scent design of Ottoman gardens was no longer just for personal delight. It was a tool of statecraft, as much a part of the palace machinery as ink or intrigue. And if someone happened to fall in love with a diplomat's daughter along the path of rosemary and orange blossom, well, that was just a fortunate side effect. After all, as Aishi once told her apprentice while gently turning a sprig of mint toward the breeze, you don't always need words. Sometimes the right scent can make even a sultan forget he's angry. It is a curious fact, one that rarely makes it into the official histories, that apricot trees once held far more political sway than certain minor viziers. They were sweet, yes, but also symbolic, tender yet firm, and, in the case of one dream-prone vizier, whisperers of divine advice. This was Vizier Mahmud, known unofficially as Mahmud of the Apricots, and less flatteringly as that man with the fruit dreams. His influence peaked during a season in which the empire enjoyed a rare and delightful surplus of apricots, a development he took as both agricultural success and cosmic approval. You see, Mahmud claimed that the apricot trees in the palace garden spoke to him, not with voices. He wasn't a madman, or at least not publicly, but with dreams, vivid, sticky, fragrant dreams in which the trees leaned down and rustled their leaves just so, murmuring advice about palace politics, foreign trade, in which Gardner was stealing extra figs. Naturally, this raised eyebrows. Even in an empire where mystics debated philosophy over figs and goats, occasionally wandered into planning meetings, tree whispering wasn't standard practice for viziers. Still, Mahmud was beloved by the palace cooks, who benefited from his frequent decrees, requiring daily deliveries of spiritually ripe apricots. The first documented result of one such dream was the infamous apricot arrangement of 1648, in which Mahmud advised repositioning the entire northern courtyard's garden layout based on what he claimed was a root-based revelation. The result: improved drainage, fewer mosquito-related complaints, and an accidental but quite charming new view of the Bosphorus. Even skeptics had to admit the trees knew something. Historians still argue whether Mahmud's dreams were inspired by divine gardening insight or a tendency to fall asleep too close to fermenting fruit. One theory suggests he was merely using apricots as metaphor, a safer way to express dangerous ideas. After all, it was much easier to say, "The apricots suggest caution with Persia," than to accuse someone of reckless diplomacy. Still, the trees did well. They were trimmed, sung to by a retired dervish who charged per stanza, and fertilized with an experimental mix of ash, cinnamon, and imported goat droppings. The resulting fruit was said to glow slightly at dusk and smell faintly of longing. Not everyone was impressed. A rival vizier, one whose name has mercifully been lost to history, but was probably something like Farrukh the Grape, enthusiast, launched a campaign to prove that grapes, not apricots, were the true voice of the divine. This led to several extremely awkward poetry readings, 2 failed wine fountains, and a brief but intense rivalry between gardeners who had once peacefully shared a fig tree. Then there was the squirrel problem. You see, when apricot trees become abundant, so do their admirers, and in this case, the admirers were a particularly cunning breed of palace squirrel, known for their bright eyes, fluffy tails, and complete disregard for imperial property rights. They nested in the apricot trees, gnawed through ceremonial banners, and once attempted to smuggle a tart through the palace kitchens by forming a single-file line behind a distracted harpist. Attempts to evict them failed. One gardener, armed with a broom and a steely gaze, managed to dislodge 3 of them before being pelted with apricot pits in what the archives refer to as the brief siege of Terrace 3. Mahmud refused to remove the trees. He insisted the squirrels were guardian spirits in itchy disguises and declared it blasphemous to interfere. Instead, he ordered tiny ladders to be built so the squirrels may ascend in dignity. These ladders, while mostly symbolic, became oddly popular with children and one very confused goat. Even as the squirrel population thrived and the apricot dreams grew increasingly metaphorical, one involved a fruit that sang opera in Greek. Mahmud's influence remained. His political advice, often veiled in orchard metaphors, seemed to bear fruit. Trade improved, border tensions eased, and once, after a particularly potent apricot dream, he predicted a heavy rainstorm that led to the preemptive distribution of umbrellas, saving the entire garden staff from an unexpected soaking and earning Mahmud a fruit tart in his honor. Of course, all good things must rot if left too long in the sun. Eventually, a new sultan arrived, less dreamy, more literal. Not fond of squirrels, Mahmud was politely retired, given a small estate with ample orchard opportunity, and quietly shuffled out of the palace. The apricot trees remained trimmed back, less worshipped, but still fragrant. The squirrels moved on to softer targets, namely the candied almond storerooms. The ladders disappeared. Only one remained, propped gently against the oldest apricot tree, carved with the faint inscription, "Climb softly, the fruit listens." To this day, if you wander through the quieter corners of the garden at dusk, where the air thickens with sweetness and the leaves rustle without wind, you might feel the urge to close your eyes just for a moment, just to see if the apricots will speak to you. 2. There is, in the brittle corners of the palace archives, a chewed fragment of a blueprint. The ink has run in places, and a paw print undeniably hoof-shaped smudges the lower edge. For many years, the scholars assumed this was merely evidence of poor storage and possibly an underpaid apprentice. But the gardeners know better. They know it was the goat. No one remembers exactly when she arrived, or why she was permitted to stay. Her fur was an unassuming brown, save for a single white spot on her left ear that resembled, if you squinted, the silhouette of Constantinople. She answered to no name, though many were offered Lady Chusalot, General Parchment, her grassiness. The kitchen boys called her that menace, but with a curious affection usually reserved for old boots or exiled relatives. The goat had taste. Unfortunately, the taste extended to paper, particularly valuable paper. She was first noticed when she wandered into the garden pavilion during a meeting of architects and philosophers, two groups that normally avoided each other on principle, but had been united that day by a shared commission: redesign the central pleasure garden to better reflect the fluidity of scent and geometry. They had, naturally, brought plans and snacks, and someone had left the door open. What followed is known, somewhat dramatically, as the consumption. In under 2 minutes, the goat had devoured a proposed layout of rose beds, an annotated list of sacred herbs, and an entire corner of a very expensive map that indicated where the sun hit the fountains during equinox. She chewed thoughtfully, blinking at the assembled thinkers as if to say, "I've read enough." Historians still argue whether the resulting design, hurriedly redrawn from memory and mild panic, was better or worse than the original. Certainly, it included several strange angles, one inexplicable spiral, and a surprise patch of shade where none had been intended. But the garden, when built, was oddly delightful. The wind moved through it as though coached. The scents lingered longer. Guests wandered for hours and rarely found the same path twice. Some claimed it made their thoughts softer, and the goat remained. She became a fixture in the garden, like the statues or the rumors about haunted hydrangeas. She had a preference for certain benches and occasionally joined picnics uninvited. She seemed particularly fond of sandalwood, and once curled up beside a visiting philosopher's sandals, chewing one thoughtfully. The philosopher took it as a sign of approval and rewrote his entire thesis in celebration. There were attempts, brief, ill-advised ones, to remove her. One bureaucrat, concerned for the safety of official documents, issued an order that the goat be relocated to a less strategic location. The gardeners protested. The scribes wept. The goat, sensing unrest, staged what can only be described as a sit-in beneath the royal apricot tree, staring balefully at passers-by until the decree was reversed. The bureaucrat, shortly thereafter, transferred himself to a monastery that specialized in silence and root vegetables. Over time, the goat acquired a kind of mythic status. Stories spread. It was said she could detect poorly written poetry and would nudge the guilty party toward better metaphors. She once headbutted a vase containing a single wilting lily, leading to the gardener discovering a hidden fungus in the soil. A child swore. She nodded approvingly at a proposal to plant more violets near the reflecting pool. Someone likely? A bored archivist
began recording her movements and comparing them to wind patterns. The results were inconclusive, but suggested that when she stood near the myrtle hedge, productivity in the imperial kitchens increased by 17%.
She was not without flaws. She once escaped into the tulip beds during peak bloom season and was only stopped by a panicked baker waving a sponge cake.
Another time,
she swallowed a ribbon meant for a diplomatic bouquet,
causing a minor scandal when the ambassador's wife received flowers tied with what turned out to be an old sandal strap. And yet, she endured. There were whispers. Of course, some claimed she was the reincarnation of a long-dead vizier sent back to nibble on inefficiency. Others believed she was a test one of those divine ones, meant to see who in the palace truly understood balance, humility, and hoof hygiene. In the quieter corners of the garden, the goat became a symbol not of chaos,
exactly,
but of the unpredictable grace that made Ottoman gardens more than rows of flowers.
She reminded everyone, builders,
poets, and diplomats alike, that perfection was not always planned. Sometimes
the paper had to be eaten for the scent to settle just right. And so, in the margin of one surviving blueprint, a recreation drawn years later by a half-blind gardener and his unusually cooperative grandson, you can still see a note, "Leave room for goat." It's unclear whether this was a practical instruction or a philosophical one. Possibly both. The goat passed, eventually, quietly, near the lavender bed she'd once flattened with her naps. A small stone was placed at the spot, not elaborate, just a worn slab, etched with a tulip and a scroll. Visitors still stop there. They leave petals, sometimes bits of ribbon. Once, someone left a folded map with a corner torn off, as tribute, and the wind, as always, carries the scent of something sweet and strange, like parchment, warmed in the sun. If you ever find yourself wandering the palace grounds, just after a polite drizzle, when the stone paths still hold the shimmer of recent weather, and the earth smells generously of forgotten roots, you might catch a scent, not a grand one like rose or jasmine, but something subtler, something that smells of cracked earth and longing, with a top note of "I know what you did last banquet." That would be the lavender oil, or, more accurately, the overripe lavender oil, which once sparked what became known as the incident of fragrance and flatulence, a chapter of garden history so embarrassing it was officially ignored in all imperial records, and unofficially beloved by anyone with a sense of humor and a poor sense of timing. The story begins, innocently enough, with a gift. A visiting dignitary from Anatolia, known more for his love of handkerchiefs than for diplomacy, brought a small silver box containing an intensely fragrant blend of lavender, musk, and something else that no one could quite identify, but everyone agreed was bold. The gift was meant to flatter. The note attached read, "For your serene and fragrant empire." The box was opened during a private garden gathering, attended by various nobles, one undercooked eunuch, and a peacock with questionable table manners. Upon unsealing the lid, a powerful wave of scent erupted, a purple fog of perfume that knocked over 2 potted herbs and caused a servant to temporarily forget his own name. The effect was polarizing. Some guests swooned with delight. Others squinted suspiciously. One unfortunate scholar inhaled too deeply and began reciting verses in Arabic, Persian, and what may have been early Hungarian. It was determined that the scent had notes of ambition and insult, which would later be the title of a banned poem about that very evening. In a quiet corner of the garden, the Sultan's favorite cousin, a man famed for both his sense of smell
and his unfortunate honesty, sniffed the air once, frowned,
and muttered, "That's not lavender. That's something else pretending to be lavender." And so began the subtle, perfumed feud. You see, in Ottoman etiquette,
flowers and scents carried layered meanings.
a rose might say peace or I'm watching you,
Mint might offer welcome or suggest you've overstated,
but a misused scent, a poorly chosen oil, that could be war. Within days,
rumors bloomed faster than the tulips.
was the gift a compliment or a coded insult?
Did the musk component suggest admiration or flatulence?
Did the Sultan's slightly reddened eyes indicate emotional appreciation or mild allergic aggression? To complicate matters, the dignitary requested that the garden staff incorporate the oil into a ceremonial display.
The chief gardener, an ambitious woman named Selvi, with a talent for pruning and diplomacy,
agreed on the condition that it be done with appropriate restraint. It was not an overzealous apprentice newly promoted, probably too enthusiastic, and possibly death-soaked not one.
but 5 ceremonial sashes in the oil.
The scent overwhelmed the entire western pavilion.
The birds went quiet.
The peacocks retreated. A squirrel dropped its date and ran.
Visitors began referring to the area as the purple stretch.
The kitchen staff refused to serve food near it. One man swore he saw the moon avoid that section of sky. Still, the dignitary beamed with pride,
unaware that his fragrant offering had become both legend and warning.
Historians still argue whether the dignitary was truly oblivious or delightfully cunning. Some suggest he'd intended to provoke a reaction all along, testing the empire's tolerance for strong personality and stronger aroma.
Others believe he simply had no nose for nuance and thought more scent meant more respect. The fallout was mild but memorable. Guests began bringing their own perfumes to balance the air.
Scented handkerchiefs were waved like diplomatic flags.
A brief trend emerged wherein nobles dabbed vinegar behind their ears for balance.
One court musician wrote a song called Too Much Lavender. Not enough. Grayson was politely asked to tour distant provinces. Eventually,
the Sultan himself intervened. During an unannounced evening stroll,
he wandered into the garden's western pavilion and promptly sneezed 5 times in succession, a reaction so rare that it was later described in a prayer. The next day,
the purple stretch was discreetly relocated.
The sashes were buried with minimal ceremony beneath a particularly judgmental cypress tree. The apprentice was reassigned to gravel alignment,
and the dignitary, still blissfully unaware,
received a thank you note, a basket of mild soaps, and a politely worded suggestion to consider saffron next time.
Selvi,
the gardener,
took it all in stride.
She later designed a new section of the garden, entirely around scent balance, blending soothing herbs with sharp-edged flowers,
floral humbleness with assertive greens.
She called it the Garden of Whispered Opinions. Visitors described it as restorative, complicated, and surprisingly nonviolent.
In the end, the incident passed,
like all overly strong fragrances do.
But the lesson lingered.
Fragrance was not just decoration, it was language.
It could flatter,
it could soothe, and if misused, it could clear a room faster than a goat with digestive regrets.
To this day, a small stone plaque stands near the edge of the western pavilion,
half hidden behind a sage bush. It reads, "In scent, as in speech, more is not always better." In a dusty corner of the garden once set aside for experimental shrubs, and now mostly used by cats, with ambitions, there stood a myrrh tree that had no business being there, imported at great expense from lands so dry that even the wind coughed politely.
The tree was a gift from a spice merchant who had run out of things to flatter the Sultan with and panicked.
Instead of gold, silks, or poems about the firmness of the imperial handshake, he sent a tree that wept.
That is to say,
it produced resin fragrant, sticky
and mysterious, the gardeners, initially unimpressed, nicknamed it the sulking stick. But one gardener took a liking to it. Her name was Rehan, and she had an eye for the misunderstood. She wore her pruning shears like jewelry and spoke to plants in 3 dialects, one of which she might have invented, while other gardeners focused on tulips, citrus, or politically strategic mint beds. Rehan fussed over the myrrh like it was a cranky noble relative she had personally promised to civilize. The tree responded, slowly, grudgingly. Its resin thickened, darkened, and began to emit a scent that was described, depending on whom you asked, as meditative, haunted, or like a grandmother's drawer of regrets. Rehan distilled it into oil and began dabbing it on her gloves, which unnerved a few people but also kept mosquitoes at bay. One morning, a cat followed her, a long, thin animal with a face like a withered vizier and a meow that could be mistaken for an insult. The cat began trailing her daily rounds. It sniffed at the myrrh tree. It pawed the base. It slept under it exactly once. Had an extremely vivid dream, judging by the twitching, and from then on followed Rehan as if she owed it an explanation. Then strange things began happening. Visitors reported a sudden change in the atmosphere near the myrrh. Tree people who sat nearby became unusually contemplative. One scribe wrote an entire treatise on ethical accountancy in a single sitting. A kitchen girl admitted she'd remembered her great-grandmother's lost stew recipe after napping beneath it. Even the goat stopped to stare at it once, sniffed twice, and walked away with the air of someone quietly unnerved. Rumors spread. Was Rehan a perfumer? A witch? A prophet of slow-growing plants? One official accused her of sorcery, claiming the tree had caused his dream journal to go off topic. When questioned, Rehan simply pointed to the myrrh and said, "It listens better than your advisors." This did not help her case. Historians still argue whether this was a case of mass suggestion, powerful fragrance, or well-timed coincidence. Some note that myrrh has long been used in religious and medicinal contexts, its scent tied to introspection, mourning, and calm. Others suspect Rehan may have been slipping cardamom into the palace tea supply on the side. Whatever the cause, the myrrh phase began. Suddenly, everyone wanted it. Courtiers requested sprigs of it. Poems were written in its honor. The Sultan's third best cousin commissioned a robe embroidered with tiny golden myrrh trees, though he mistakenly wore it during the summer banquet and passed out from heat and reverence. Rehan, for her part, said nothing. She trimmed the tree, collected the resin, and made quiet notes in a little book bound in olive bark. She occasionally shared a sample with the herbalist, who described the scent as smelling like endings, but in a nice way. But then came the accusation. A minor noble, unshaven, overdressed, and overly fond of fermented pomegranate, claimed that the scent had clouded his judgment and whispered things. He accused Rehan of enchanting the tree, possibly the entire garden, and proposed it be removed before more thoughts were rearranged. There was a hearing. The Sultan himself attended. Mostly out of boredom and mild curiosity, Rehan arrived late, holding a sprig of myrrh, and followed, as always, by the sarcastic cat. When asked to defend herself, she offered no elaborate argument. She stepped forward, crushed a few myrrh leaves in her palm, and held it up for the Sultan to smell. He did. He paused. He blinked slowly, as though a thought had just walked across his mind barefoot. Then he said, "This reminds me of my father's study." The room fell silent. The Sultan, who rarely spoke of his father, and had once banned all talk of incense after a particularly traumatic poetry reading, smiled faintly and waved his hand. "Let the tree grow," he said. "Let it whisper if it must." Rehan bowed. The cat meowed. The noble in question reportedly fled to the tulip fields and developed a lifelong aversion
to subtlety. In the years that followed, the myrrh tree remained. Visitors sat near it. Some wrote, some wept, some simply dozed in that strange patch of shade where the sun never quite scolded. Rayhan retired quietly, her gloves permanently scented, her little book unread, and the cat, it lived unusually long, acquired a taste for coriander, and was last seen curled on the stone beneath the myrrh, dreaming perhaps of something older than words. In every empire, there are declarations carved in stone, etched into law, and passed down through scrolls delivered by donkeys with far too much attitude. And then there are the declarations no one quite remembers making, but that everyone obeys. One such decree involved violets, not just any violets. Mind you, these were Ottoman violets, small, moody, fragrant, and mysteriously regarded with the same sacred hush one reserves for ancient relics or extremely breakable heirlooms. For a time, violets were considered holy, not metaphorically. Officially, liturgically, which, to be clear, made picnicking near them mildly illegal. Historians still argue over how this came to be. Some trace it to a wandering scholar with too many allergies and a habit of dramatic sneezing. Others point to a poem now lost that supposedly compared violet fragrance to the breath of angels at dawn. Still others blame a misinterpreted sermon in which a cleric, while attempting to praise humility, got sidetracked by a violet bush that had grown aggressively into the aisle. Whatever the cause, violets became a religious matter. Temples requested violet arrangements for ceremonies. Religious scholars debated the appropriate direction in which to plant them. And one particularly devoted sect of flower monks, yes, they existed. And yes, they were very serious about. Sandals insisted violets be walked around, not through. Even when composing theological verses about onions, this violet veneration reached its peak during the reign of Sultan Bayezid, the occasionally bemused. One afternoon, while enjoying a bowl of chilled apricot soup in his garden, he was presented with a cluster of violets arranged on a small gold plate, accompanied by a note that read, "To remind your grace of the scent of humility." Bayezid, already suspicious of scented allegories ever since the clove debacle, sniffed the flowers cautiously and asked, "And what does arrogance smell like?" Then the court froze. A flute player swallowed his mouthpiece. A gardener tripped over a wheelbarrow full of prophetic leeks. Bayezid, however, merely chuckled and waved the question away. "Never mind," he said. "Let the violets speak." And speak they did, or rather, they wafted. The garden violets became a symbol not only of humility, but of measured wisdom. It was said that if you couldn't smell the violets in a conversation, it wasn't worth continuing. Courtiers began wearing tiny violet blossoms behind one ear. Sermons were occasionally prefaced with, "As the violets remind us," and followed by something vaguely floral and deeply confusing. One gardener, Hafizeh, took it upon herself to preserve the violet purity of the palace grounds. She developed a soil blend of ash, crushed fig bark, and camel compost marketed unofficially as Hafizi's holy dirt. Her violets bloomed vigorously. She claimed they whispered secrets when the moon was just right. No one dared challenge her. She had the look of someone who had tamed both roses and bureaucrats. Then came the controversy. It began, as so many scandals do, with an ambitious apprentice, young, enthusiastic, and profoundly colorblind. He was tasked with planting violets along the northern walkway in preparation for a high-ranking mystic's visit. Unfortunately, he mistook a shipment of experimental hybrid pansies for violets and planted them in full ceremonial formation. The result? Pandemonium. The mystic arrived, bowed low, inhaled deeply, and immediately recoiled with the cry, These violets are lying.
A full investigation followed.
The apprentice was demoted to pond leaf skimmer,
A job that came with wet socks and mild shame.
the pansies were quietly relocated,
And violet verification protocols were put in place, including the now famous 2 sniffs and a prayer test.
but the damage was done.
Doubts began to fester. Were all violets sacred? Were some just pretending? What if humility had shifted fragrance?
Historians still debate whether this was the beginning of the so-called violet schism. For a brief time, factions emerged.
Soft violetists argued that any flower bearing the proper scent could be holy. True violetists insisted on lineage tracing back to the original courtyard bloom, kissed by dew and poetry.
A third group, fragrant skeptics, refused to comment and just wanted to be left alone with their basil.
The palace, in its usual fashion, let the arguments roll on, quietly adjusting the garden signage to read, "Probably violets," and leaving it at that.
Eventually, as with most things sacred and floral,
The fuss faded.
the violets continued to bloom.
The cats continued to sleep among them with complete theological indifference.
And a new proverb entered the garden staff's daily banter.
If the violets offend you, check your soul.
Or your nose,
Hafizi retired,
her reputation intact.
her compost still mildly terrifying.
The apprentice redeemed himself by inventing a moss-based bench cushion that received 3 separate commendations for unexpected comfort.
And the Sultan, he reportedly asked for violets with his soup every spring.
Just to see if anyone would panic.
To this day, a small violet patch remains beside the old marble bench near the olive grove.
Visitors who find it often pause,
Breathe deeply,
and for reasons they can't quite explain lower their voices.
because in that fragrant hush,
Among the modest leaves and tiny blooms, there's a sense of something just beyond words.
not quite holiness,
Not quite history,
but close enough to both that you feel compelled to sit and listen. There are few phrases in history as ominous as the Sultan grew bored, especially when that boredom involved flowers.
for decades. The tulip had reigned supreme in the Ottoman gardens, not just as a bloom, but as a symbol, a metaphor,
And an elaborate excuse for people to compete over who could host the most pretentious evening stroll. Tulips were everywhere, carved into stone, stitched into cushions, painted on teacups,
and, most aggressively,
planted in complicated geometric patterns that required aerial viewing for full appreciation.
and then
One spring morning, Sultan Murad, the occasionally unpredictable, stepped onto his veranda, squinted at the tulip beds below, and sighed the sigh of a man who had eaten too many of the same apricots.
no more tulips, he declared.
A silence fell over the court that was only broken by the distant,
Faint sound of a gardener dropping their spade in horror.
"No more?" asked his chief advisor.
Gently massaging his temples.
Murad nodded.
They look like smug onions. We need something new. Historians still argue what prompted the outburst.
Some say it was a dream involving a talking daffodil. Others blame a diplomatic gift of tulip-scented socks that may have insulted the Sultan's feet. Regardless,
The order was clear. Tulipomania was over.
the garden staff,
Naturally,
panicked.
they had invested heavily emotionally, horticulturally, and financially in tulip culture. There were entire ledgers dedicated to bulb lineage.
Tulip festivals had their own embroidered banners.
Poets had built their reputations on tulip sonnets.
A goat had once been crowned tulip monarch during a poorly supervised equinox celebration. But Murad was firm. "Replace them," he said,
With something honest,
something unexpected.
this led to the brief and deeply confusing period of the Great Onion Experiment.
The logic, if it can be called that,
Was as follows.
if tulips were related to onions and they are, botanically speaking, then perhaps the reverse was also true. Perhaps onions could be refined,
Perhaps they had simply been misunderstood all along. And so the gardens began to shift. First came the ornamental onions, with their curious globe-like blossoms that looked like fireworks caught mid-sneeze. Then came the scented chives, the garlic lilies, and, at one deeply unfortunate moment, a bed of full cooking onions planted alongside marigolds in what was optimistically labeled the earthier fragrance path. It did not go well. Visitors were confused. Poets refused to compose. One small child cried uncontrollably for 7 minutes after mistaking a blooming leek for a disappointed parrot. The wind carried a scent not of paradise but of lunch, and not the good kind. A passing ambassador from Florence muttered, "So, this is revenge," and took his leave. Still, Murad remained delighted. At last, he declared, inhaling a waft of wild shallot, a garden that tells the truth. To appease the other courtiers, the gardeners devised elaborate ways to elevate the onion. They braided leaves into arches, surrounded bulbs with gold-painted pebbles, and launched an ambitious and quickly forgotten project to train squirrels to deliver cloves of garlic wrapped in silk. One gardener, desperate to keep her position, created the first known onion bouquet for the spring festival. It was presented with great ceremony. It cleared the room in under 2 minutes. By midsummer, a compromise began to form. The onion stayed, but so did other blooms. Violets returned. Jasmine crept in again. Rose beds were quietly restored in side corridors where the Sultan rarely walked. The great tulip beds were replaced with experimental patches. Hyacinth here, saffron crocus there. A single unlabeled shrub known only as mild regret, Murad, perhaps sensing the slow rebellion, eventually relented, not with words. He never retracted an edict, but with a quiet nod when a tray of tulip tea was served, and a single bloom, tucked behind a napkin, went conspicuously unburned. From then on, tulips became less of a religion and more of a seasonal treat. Their worship softened. Their symbolism faded just enough to make room for other scents. The gardens grew wilder, less symmetrical, more like dreams and less like diagrams. Visitors described them as refreshingly strange, a bit emotional, and probably full of secrets. The chief gardener, an old man named Zia, who had once tried to teach Rosemary to dance, was asked what he thought of the changes. He shrugged and said, "The tulips were proud. The onions were honest. The real trick is knowing when to stop planting symbols and start planting shade." A few months later, a new bed appeared at the garden's center, circular, untitled, filled with a rotating cast of blooms, no labels, no themes, just scent, movement, and a single stone inscribed with Murad's only known poem. Beneath the petal, truth may grow, even if it smells like stew. And to this day, if you visit the garden in early spring, you may find a few brave tulips blooming near the ornamental onions, not in defiance, not even in compromise, just there, quietly coexisting, as if to say, empires may declare, but gardens remember. Section 15. Ladders are one of those garden tools that rarely earn poetic praise. You never hear a court poet sigh dreamily over a stepladder. No ambassador ever gasped at a gracefully positioned rung. And yet, one should never underestimate the capacity of a poorly timed lemon harvest to shift the tides of imperial regulation. It all began with lemons, specifically an ambitious tree in the southeastern orchard that had, by some miracle or possibly bribery, produced an extraordinary yield. The lemons were golden, round, and so plump that even the cat attempted to roll one under a bench, like a furry merchant testing produce. Gardeners cooed over them. Palace chefs hovered with suspicious eagerness. Even the goat, who normally scoffed at citrus, gave one a nibble, before backing away with the expression of someone who had just licked enlightenment and regretted it. Naturally, someone had to harvest them, and as fate would have it,
that someone was Bekir, Bekir the Bold, as he called himself, Bekir the Bumbler,
as everyone else did.
He was young, full of enthusiasm,
and only moderately qualified to use a ladder. On the day in question, he arrived early,
armed with a wicker basket, a freshly oiled mustache,
and a ladder of suspicious length.
It was taller than necessary, slightly crooked, and allegedly donated by a cousin who once repaired roofs. By guessing, the first few lemons came down smoothly. Bekir hummed. The basket filled. All was well. Then he reached,
not heroically, not even urgently, just that one tiny,
hopeful reach for a lemon positioned slightly above his comfort zone. The ladder wobbled. Bekir froze. A breeze joined the conversation. The ladder, possibly inspired by a nearby poem about impermanence, gave up entirely. What followed was not tragic, but theatrical. Bekir descended with a shout, narrowly missed a bush of historical significance, and landed in a crate of rose mulch with a sound described by witnesses as half thud, half insult. The lemon, it bounced twice, then rolled gently into the open lap of the palace scribe, who had come to write about irrigation and left with 3 bruises and an accidental haiku. News of the fall spread faster than the smell of mulched pride. By afternoon,
the incident had been retold in 5 languages and set to music by a court lute enthusiast who needed a distraction from his latest breakup. By evening, it had become a minor scandal. A vizier demanded to know why unapproved ladders were being used near culinary produce. A herbalist claimed lemon trees were clearly unsafe and suggested replacing them with mellow cucumbers. The goat, never one to miss an opportunity, knocked over the ladder and stood atop it as though auditioning for symbolic relevance. Historians still argue whether the Sultan personally issued the resulting edict or merely nodded vaguely while being read a summary, but soon after, the first official Ottoman ladder regulation was born. It was surprisingly thorough. Section 1, all ladders must be registered, sanded, and not taller than the tallest gardener plus 1 goose. Section 2, lemon harvesting shall be supervised by a second party, ideally literate. Section 3, no musical instruments are permitted during ascent. Section 4, should a fall occur, all produce must be inspected for bruising. Endure unintended philosophy. Bekir, for his part, recovered with minimal injury but maximum fame. He was reassigned to ground-level duties, where he developed a passion for mint cultivation and told the latter story at every opportunity, often embellishing the height to 4 men and a camel. He later penned a small book titled The View from Below, Musings of a Cautious Climber, which sold moderately well among bureaucrats and goat herders, but the incident had lasting effects. Gardeners became more mindful. Ladders were inspected. Safety protocols were whispered with reverence. A small plaque was erected beneath the infamous lemon tree, bearing Bekir's own words, "To reach too high is to tempt gravity's laughter." The lemon tree, unfazed, continued to grow. Each spring, it dropped fruit with calculated indifference, as if reminding the world that nature respects no policy unless bribed with compost. Over time, the ladder incident became part of garden lore. Apprentices were told the tale during orientation. A ceremonial ladder inspection day was held annually, during which jokes were made, safety drills were performed, and someone inevitably pretended to fall and was chased by an irate cat. And somewhere in the heart of the orchard, that crooked old ladder was retired, leaned gently against a storage wall, and left there like an old warrior, wobbly, weathered, and just slightly smug. Because sometimes it's not the flower or the fragrance that changes the course of history. Sometimes it's the fall. If you pressed your ear close enough,
to the marble fountain in the western courtyard. Carefully, of course, so as not to alarm the peacocks or startle your own reflection. You might swear the water was whispering, not rushing, not gurgling, whispering. At least, that's what the records claim. The whispering fountains, as they were later called by mystics, bored scribes, and one overly romantic guard captain, were a set of tiered waterworks tucked into the quieter part of the palace garden. Designed during an architectural phase best described as playful mysticism meets questionable acoustics. The fountains were originally meant to provide a cooling breeze and a pleasing soundtrack for afternoon courtship attempts. Instead, they caused suspicion, confusion, and, briefly, an unsanctioned belief system. The concept, on paper, was elegant. Channels of water, carved with precision and lined with herbs thyme, and a variety of mint, so potent it could unbutton your collar from across the room, would allow water to travel in looping rivulets. These channels twisted and converged at precise angles, forming geometric patterns that caught light and released fragrance as they flowed. But something went wrong, or perhaps something went too right, because the sound the water made wasn't normal. It didn't burble, it didn't splash, it hissed, murmured, drifted, not in full words, certainly, but in patterns that made the hair on your forearms stand up and your mind begin to fill in the blanks. I swear it said, "Be patient," muttered a janissary once, after spending a long afternoon beside it. "No," said the old gardener nearby, pruning dill with priestly seriousness. "It said pay rent," and so began the debate. Was it merely an auditory illusion, a trick of flow and echo, or something more? Had the fountains been designed with hidden messages, like a marble oracle muttering through scented steam? Historians still argue, of course. One theory suggests the carved water channels, aligned with sacred geometry, and under the right breeze, emitted syllables through natural resonance. Another insists it was nothing more than pareidolia, people hearing meaning where none existed, like seeing horses in clouds or sincerity in a diplomat's smile. But the palace staff believed. Soon, a small crowd of regulars developed, the whisper listeners. They gathered on Tuesdays, sat in silence, brought notebooks. One attempted to interpret the fountain's advice for romantic endeavors and claimed a 62% success rate. Another believed the fountain only spoke truth after sunset, and once waited 3 hours in the rain for a whispered recipe, which turned out to be soup. One poet, mildly famous for rhyming garden with pardon, wrote an entire series of verses based on the fountain's messages. They were celebrated, then banned, then celebrated again in a slightly different font. Naturally, some people objected. A certain minister of logistics, who preferred numbers to nonsense, tried to have the fountains restructured. He proposed covering the channels with latticed brass to eliminate auditory deviation. The plan was foiled when the goat, perhaps sensing cultural peril, escaped from her pen and chewed his blueprints to shreds. No one stopped her. Several people offered her extra figs in thanks. Then came the philosopher, a tall, tired man named Idris who had not smiled since the last eclipse. He studied the fountains for 7 days, wrote nothing, then announced that the whispering was not speech, but thought our own thoughts, bouncing back at us in scent and sound. He bowed deeply and left the garden. A pigeon landed on his scroll. The theory caught on. Briefly, new signs were erected. The fountain reflects only what you bring to it. This led to a rise in self-conscious loitering. Several courtiers avoided the area entirely, fearing what they might hear. One man claimed the fountain told him he was bad at chess. His wife agreed. To this day, the whispering fountains remain. No one dares clean them too thoroughly, lest the murmurs stop. The mint is replaced regularly. A stone bench nearby is often occupied by visitors,
staring into the ripples and waiting for answers, for poetry, for that faint word that sounds like forgive, but could also be fig. And every so often, someone swears they hear a message meant only for them. A name, a phrase, a reminder, a warning. They blink, they smile, they walk away just a bit slower than they arrived. The gardeners say nothing. But sometimes, late at night, when the moonlight dances over the water, and even the cats have gone quiet, one might catch a glimpse of Rayhan, or Akif, or even Bakir the lemon survivor, sitting by the fountain listening, head tilted, just in case it says something new. The argument began with fennel, not politics, not religion, not even who had stolen the last quince tart from the ambassador's tray, though that remained unresolved. No, it was fennel innocent, feathery, licorice-scented fennel that divided the sisters. They were imperial sisters, mind you, not in the formal royal succession, but close enough to require silk slippers and slightly uncomfortable jewelry. Fatma and Layla were their names, and they had shared everything since childhood nannies, versus a mild allergy to goats, and a deep appreciation for lounging. Their garden plots, though, were separate. Each had a small, private corner of the palace grounds. These were their sanctuaries, their confessionals, their stage sets for dramatic sighing and the quiet consumption of rose petal jam. And for years, all was harmonious. Layla's garden favored violets, soft colors, and scents that whispered. Fatma's leaned bold citrus trees, cloves, and one ambitious pomegranate that refused to mind its borders. And then, one spring morning, Layla decided to plant fennel. Historians are unclear on her motivations. Some say she was inspired by a dream involving Roman emperors and a very talkative stew. Others believe she merely liked the feathery texture. Whatever the cause, she planted a row of fennel along the shared hedge. Fatma was not pleased. Her letter to Layla, preserved in a drawer, still scented faintly of indignation, began, "Dearest sister, I write not in anger, but in caution. Your fennel breathes too boldly." Layla's reply, "Dearest sister, it is not the fennel that breathes. It is your prejudice against Anise." Thus began the great fennel silence. No shouting, no slamming of teacups, just an immediate, complete cessation of communication. For 39 days, the sisters refused to acknowledge each other's presence. When passing in the corridor, they would stop, observe a flower, and comment loudly to their attendants about the importance of true botanical taste. Garden staff quickly found themselves in diplomatic roles they had not trained for. Fatma's head gardener was ordered to install taller hedges. Layla's staff responded by adding trellises to grow climbing herbs in direct visual opposition. A potted war ensued. Lavender arranged like defensive battlements. Marjoram installed as passive-aggressive borders, and once a strategically placed melon that may or may not have been a metaphor. The scent of fennel, sharp, sweet, undeniable, wafted into Fatma's garden each afternoon, carried by the same breeze that had once shared jasmine and mutual fondness. She claimed it gave her headaches. Layla, in turn, began adding fennel to her cooking. Rumors spread that she served it with a smile so serene it required investigation. The goat, sensing tension, refused to graze on either side. The cats chose teams. The palace steward considered assigning a mediator, until reminded that gardening feuds were outside his jurisdiction. Historians still debate whether the Sultan was aware. Some suggest he found the whole affair amusing and once ordered a statue of two women holding fennel to be placed quietly between their quarters. It was later removed after both sisters simultaneously had it covered in peony petals and declared it an insult to the horticultural arts. And yet, as with all great silences, This one could not last forever.
On the 40th day,
Rain fell, not a polite drizzle, but a proper, opinionated spring storm, the kind that sends gardeners rushing, tulips weeping,
and unattended scrolls into soggy oblivion.
The gardens flooded in places. Herbs leaned with the weight of water. One rogue rosebush collapsed dramatically onto a bench.
Fatma,
Wrapped in a cloak of embroidered disapproval, went to check on her citrus grove.
Layla, carrying a parasol and a slight limp from a sandal disagreement,
Arrived to rescue her fennel. They met at the hedge. Mud splattered. Rain poured.
and amid the dripping leaves and collapsing chamomile, Layla slipped,
Not far.
not elegantly,
Just enough to land squarely in her beloved fennel.
crushing several stalks and emitting a scent so concentrated it briefly redefined the afternoon. Fatma blinked. Layla, lying on her side in the wreckage of her argument, laughed, a single hiccuping, rain-spattered laugh.
Then another,
Fatma, always the more theatrical, sniffed, stepped forward, and offered her hand. No words were spoken. The silence was lifted not with apologies, but with shared indignity, and the realization that no feud can survive a damp backside and the smell of licorice gone rogue. Afterward, the fennel was trimmed. A new path was laid between their plots. Fatma gifted Layla a pot of thyme with a note that read, "For balance." Layla responded with a small plaque placed near the hedge. "All fragrance is fleeting. Sisters are not." To this day, gardeners speak of the feud with a mix of reverence and exasperation. It is taught in apprentice orientation as a lesson in olfactory diplomacy. The hedge still stands neatly trimmed, occasionally trimmed by squirrels, and often blooming with mutual compromise. And the fennel, it grows modestly now, respected but kept in check, just like every strong opinion in a well-tended garden.
The nightingales arrived in late spring.
Right on time and entirely uninvited. They came in twos and threes at first, dark-eyed little singers with voices far too large for their frames, and nestled themselves into the olive groves and the denser jasmine hedges. The gardeners didn't mind.
Nightingales were excellent for pest control, and their melodies helped muffle the less elegant noises of the garden, like snoring scribes or the occasional goat-related collapse. But it wasn't long before someone began to suspect they were up to more than just warbling. That someone was a court musician named Dervish Hassan, who had recently returned from a brief exile in Bursa over a misunderstanding involving bagpipes and a ceremonial breakfast. Hassan had a sensitive ear,
A flair for metaphor, and a long-standing suspicion that nature was secretly judging human music.
Upon hearing the nightingale's evening trills, so perfectly timed, so achingly in tune, he announced,
With the solemnity of a man who once tuned a harp with his teeth,
that the birds were offering notes, not notes, like written symbols,
notes,
as in advice.
to whom, the palace steward asked, not unkindly.
To me, Hassan whispered.
Thus began what came to be known unofficially,
And never in the presence of anyone with military authority, as the feathered conservatory. Each evening, Hassan would wander the garden with his oud slung over one shoulder and a scrap of parchment tucked into his sleeve.
he'd pause beneath the myrtle trees,
Wait for the nightingales to begin.
and then attempt to transcribe their song into something playable. The results were uneven. One melody brought tears to the eyes of a visiting prince. Another caused the ambassador from Ragusa to declare it a fine tune. If one enjoys being mildly insulted by music,
But Hassan was convinced. He claimed the birds sang not random notes, but specific intervals meant to unlock mood and memory.
he pointed out that their songs grew more complex as the moon waxed and simpler when garlic was being dried nearby. He was certain the birds were responding to changes in the scent patterns of the garden and
Perhaps even directing them. Historians still argue whether there was anything to this, One skeptical archivist suggested Hassan had simply consumed too much rose syrup, but the patterns persisted.
Gardeners began to notice that nightingale songs changed, depending on what plants were in bloom.
The notes seemed sharper near thyme, dreamier near lavender, suspiciously sarcastic near rosemary. It didn't take long for the court musicians to get involved. They began scheduling rehearsals in the garden at dusk.
Flutists perched near fig trees, lute players tuned beside the fountains. There was even an experimental trio that positioned itself between 3 species of narcissus to achieve emotional triangulation.
The nightingales, unimpressed, kept singing anyway, often in time,
Often off-key,
and always louder than expected. A new theory emerged, that the birds were not offering musical guidance, but critique. This gained traction after Hassan premiered a new composition titled Midnight Over Mint, which he claimed was inspired by the birds' Wednesday murmurs. The nightingales responded by going completely silent for the first 47 seconds, then erupting into a chaotic flurry of trills so dissonant that one cellist dropped her bow and said, "Well,
that settles it." The goat, who had wandered into the rehearsal and chewed on the second violin's score,
appeared to agree.
Eventually, the court tired of the experiment. The musicians returned to the halls. The scribes stopped notating bird calls,
And Hassan, ever the optimist, retired to a bench near the lilacs with his oud and a loaf of bread shaped like a treble clef.
He claimed the birds still spoke to him.
No one argued, but something remained.
The idea of listening to the garden,
To the birds,
to the scent of the breeze before it changed, stuck in people's minds. Gardeners began to hum while planting, adjusting their rhythm to match the chirps around them.
musicians occasionally wandered outside,
Not to perform, but to listen. A tradition quietly formed.
each spring. On the first evening, the nightingales returned.
A single musician would sit in the courtyard and offer a melody back. Nothing formal, nothing recorded, just a gesture.
And sometimes the birds answered.
A few years later, a visiting scholar from Persia noted the phenomenon and wrote in his journal,
In Istanbul, even the birds have opinions on cadence.
to this day, if you sit in the garden just after sunset,
The nightingales might still sing for you, not loudly, not showily,
but with the careful insistence of those who know what the wind is doing and why that jasmine patch doesn't like the new gardener. And if you listen closely, very closely, you might hear the whisper of an old oud string and the faintest laughter of a musician who once believed the birds were teaching him. He wasn't wrong.
in the colder months.
When even the rosemary sighed and the rose hips tightened their belts, a certain courtyard became unexpectedly popular, not for its beauty or its poetry or even the presence of the cat that looked like an exiled philosopher,
But because it smelled like camphor.
Now, camphor is one of those fragrances that divides opinion. Some say it smells like clarity,
Others say it smells like grandmother remedies, failed romance,
and a stubborn ghost trying to disinfect a room.
Regardless,
It had one undeniable quality.
it made your nose feel alert, even when your feet had given up entirely.
The courtyard in question was not meant to be famous. It had been constructed as an afterthought somewhere between a storage annex and a lemon press, paved in uneven flagstones, and shaded by a stand of stubborn trees that refused to bloom in summer, but burst forth in pale blossoms every winter, like smug prophets of reversal.
It was here that the camphor experiment began. The idea came from Etham,
A junior herbalist with a perpetually suspicious expression and a nose for opportunity. He had read in an old scroll that camphor,
when crushed and steeped in oil, not only invigorated the senses but also kept scorpions, boredom, and at least 3 kinds of diplomatic malaise at bay. Ethem, seeing the chilly courtyard and its tendency to freeze noble toes by mid-morning, had a vision. He brewed a camphor blend carefully, precisely, possibly while humming to himself in ancient Armenian, and used it to scent the stones, not heavily, just enough that, when walked upon, the warmth of passing slippers would release a small puff of bracing coolness into the air. The effect was immediate. The scribe who first walked the path declared he felt 10% more awake. A steward claimed it reversed his seasonal depression. The ambassador from Moldavia marched across it, stopped, marched back, and announced he had just remembered the name of his second cousin's third wife, previously lost to time. And plum brandy, word spread, and with it, the crowds. The courtyard became a destination. Poets came to clear their heads. Diplomats came to recover from long meals. Even the cat, normally indifferent to fads, took to lounging near the center stone and twitching his tail with mild approval. But not all went well. One evening, during a particularly icy month, a minor accident occurred. An ambassador from the north, a man of heavy coat, heavier eyebrows, and a walking stick that seemed to resent its duties, stepped onto the camphor stones while reciting something mournful. His boots, polished too well and designed for snow, not scent, slipped. He did not fall gracefully. Historians refer to this moment with dry understatement as the treaty tumble. The ambassador spun once, flailed twice, and landed in a position that, had it not involved 3 startled pigeons and a yelp in Old Slavic, might have resembled a yoga pose. Papers flew, a hat was lost, a small shrub, uninvolved but nearby, was slightly trampled. The palace guards arrived too late to prevent anything, but just in time to pretend they'd seen none of it. To everyone's relief, the ambassador rose, dusted himself off, and began laughing. He declared the camphor stones the most invigorating experience I've had since my wedding, and later insisted the incident be commemorated with a poem. The poem, which included the phrase, "And down I fell, uplifted still," was embroidered onto a scarf and gifted to the Sultan. The scarf was never worn, but the story traveled. From then on, visitors were warned. The courtyard awakens more than just your senses. Traction was improved. A handrail was installed, discreetly and tastefully shaped like a vine. The camphor remained strong, sharp, strangely comforting, and over time, the courtyard became more than a novelty. It became a place of recovery. After long meetings, tired eyes found solace there. Couriers stopped to breathe before bad news deliveries. Lovers, bracing themselves for awkward farewells, walked its edges and let the cool scent settle their hearts. Even the goat, notoriously unflappable, once paused there during a midwinter prowl and stood silently for a full minute, chewing nothing, contemplating everything. The gardeners took special care of it. Etham refined the blend, adding trace amounts of eucalyptus and what he cryptically referred to as frost mint, though no one could confirm such a plant existed. He retired years later with a scroll of testimonials, a pair of fur-lined boots gifted by the Moldavian ambassador, and a cat that may or may not have chosen him. Today, the camphor courtyard remains tucked between more glamorous spaces, still slightly uneven, always just a little colder than expected. Visitors walk it slowly. Some pause in the middle and breathe deep. Others keep their eyes on the stones, as though expecting something more than aroma. Perhaps a revelation. And sometimes, late at night, when the moonlight glints off the frost and the air sharpens your thoughts, just enough, you might hear the faint sound of a diplomat's hat landing softly in the bushes. By the time the stars settled low enough to lean against the cypress trees, and the fountains began to burble with a sleepier rhythm, the garden would begin to exhale, not literally, of course, but if you stood still, really still, you could feel it. A long,
fragrant sigh through the jasmine, the citrus, the rose,
And the rosemary,
even the stubborn mint would loosen up a little, just enough to say,
the day is done.
the gardeners had names for this time.
The blue hush,
The last wind,
the hour when even the lilacs stop arguing.
and in this hour,
The goats came back,
not marching, not frolicking, just returning.
in that sneaky, sideways way goats do. They appeared from corners they had definitely not been hiding in all day.
From under benches, behind hedges, occasionally from the small storage shed where Bakir once accidentally locked himself for 3 hours with nothing but a broom and a terrifyingly judgmental duck. The goats never disturbed the flowers.
Well, almost never. They had a certain reverence for the garden at night, a sort of goat code that even the gardeners couldn't decode. They'd nibble fallen figs, sniff the lemon rinds left by forgetful tea drinkers, and occasionally pause to contemplate something no human could see. It was said, though not in front of the palace steward, that the goats knew things, that they had always known things, that they had watched the rise and fall of every imperial gardener, every poet with a fragile ego, every diplomat who mistook fennel for treachery, and that when they chewed on your documents,
It was not carelessness.
it was commentary.
Tonight, the goats move quietly through the garden. Their hooves make soft clicks on the tiles, and their eyes catch just enough moonlight to look faintly magical,
Or at least suspicious. They pass the myrrh tree,
still weeping gently into the earth. They walk under the whispering fountains, which now babble in their native tongue of hush and hush and hush, somewhere near the center of the garden, beside a weathered plaque that once bore a quote but now only offers moss. A gardener closes a gate,
not with a clang, but a tap enough to let the garden know it may rest.
She walks slowly, pulling her shawl tighter, passing the patches of violet, the politically controversial fennel, and the rose bush that once made a minister weep in public. Above her, the sky darkens to velvet.
The stars don't twinkle. Exactly. They blink sleepy.
Scattered blinks like lanterns drowsing in the rafters of heaven.
The scents shift. Jasmine fades. Mint strengthens. Lavender rolls in like a quiet sea.
The last note of a nightingale, just one, rises above the stillness.
No melody, just a reminder that something, somewhere,
Is still awake.
and then the wind stills.
The goats settle in the hedges.
The garden sleeps. The fires have gone low now. The air has turned cool and slow.
Even the most talkative herbs' time, basil,
And that one chive with a grudge have fallen quiet.
the fountains gurgle more softly.
Less like conversation and more like memory.
Stone grows cold underfoot. Leaves tremble just once before resting. The olive trees lean in toward one another, as if finishing a thought that began decades ago. Somewhere,
A scribe's candle has burned to its base.
somewhere else,
A teacup,
long abandoned, gathers the scent of night into itself.
and you're still here.
Wrapped in that old breath of garden air, part rose,
Part something unnameable.
maybe you've found your bench. Maybe you've wandered the paths in your mind, followed the scent trails the wind left behind, like silk ribbons across your thoughts. It's all quiet now. The poems, the plants, the goat debates, the whispering water, all tucked in.
Whatever waited in the day has stepped aside. Whatever's coming tomorrow can wait a little longer.
Right now, the garden dreams.
And so can you.
Everything's quiet now. You're safe. Let the rest take you.